Gone with the Wind might very well be the most famous film in history. Even people who haven't seen it can usually throw out at least a quote or two.
You should be kissed and often, and by someone who knows how.
Released on December 15, 1939, Gone with the Wind quickly became the highest-grossing film of all time, a title it still retains even 80 years later, after you adjust for inflation and ticket pricing. It went on to win Best Picture at the Oscars amidst a field of competitors that make up what is widely considered to be one of the greatest years for film of all time. Like, it's so good that Only Angels Have Wings wasn't even nominated. But despite all that fame, it is 4 hours long, and it is 8 decades old. And when I ran a recent Twitter poll to see how many people were able to confidently recount the plot, only 26% of respondents said yes. So for those who don't know, Gone with the Wind tells the story of Katie Scarlett O'Hara.
Fiddly-dee. War, war, war. This war talk's spoiling all the fun at every party this spring. I get so bored I could scream.
A young woman living on a Georgia slave plantation in the early 1860s. Her doting family sports an overabundance of good land, and she's got her choice of bows from across the county.
I think Charles Hamilton may get it.
Oh, thank you, Miss O'Hara.
The closest thing to a problem in her life is the fact that the one man she actually wants, Ashley Wilkes, is already engaged to Melanie Hamilton, a woman who has the unconscionable gall to be completely amenable under every possible circumstance.
Scarlett's just high-spirited and vivacious. I love you.
Scarlett.
I love you, I do.
Well,
Then, the Civil War breaks out.
Isn't it thrilling? Mr. Lincoln has called for soldiers, volunteers to fight against us.
Fiddly-dee, don't you men ever think about anything important?
At first, things go well for the South. The Rebs lick the Yankees for the first 2.5 years of the war.
General Lee has completely whipped the enemy and swept the Yankee army northward from Virginia.
But then things take a turn.
some little town in Pennsylvania called Gettysburg.
By the end of the war, Scarlett loses everything, all but the burned-out husk of her former family estate. So Scarlett vows to reclaim her family wealth by absolutely any means necessary.
As God is my witness, I'll never be hungry again.
You'd think from the music that this was the end of the film, but it's actually just intermission. So Scarlett starts climbing the social ladder in a post-war world, lying, cheating, plotting, scheming, and ruthlessly undercutting all her competitors, even going so far as to steal her sister's fiancé because he owns a lumber mill that she wants to control.
I left my muff at home. Would you mind if I put my hand in your pocket?
All the while, Scarlett never stops courting Ashley Wilkes, who has this unnerving habit of refusing, but not actually discouraging, any of her advances.
Scarlett, you're so fine and strong and beautiful. Not just your sweet face, my dear.
And all the while, there's Rhett Butler.
He looks as if he knows what I look like without my shimmy.
A man of few convictions who takes an instant liking to Scarlett despite her repeated, albeit half-hearted, vows to never fall for him.
Well, I won't kiss you for it either.
He becomes a supporting character in almost every major episode of her life, getting her out of numerous scrapes while simultaneously pursuing his own interests. Eventually they marry, but even then, Scarlett makes clear that the arrangement is more about her financial security than anyone's personal feelings.
What are you thinking about, Scarlett?
I'm thinking about how rich we are.
Years later, it all comes to a head after Scarlett has sacrificed every last scrap of self-respect in her pursuit of financial gain, only to realize right when she's about to lose everything that perhaps she's been chasing the wrong dream for all these years.
I can't think about this now. I'll go crazy if I do. I'll think about it tomorrow.
So why are we talking about this 80-year-old film today? Well, in 2015, Lou Lumenick of the New York Post, which is admittedly a complete birdcage liner of a publication, wrote an op-ed claiming that Gone with the Wind was undeniably racist, that it embraced the view that slavery wasn't such a bad thing, and that it should go the way of the Confederate flag and not be exhibited publicly anymore. Then in 2017, the Orpheum Theater in Tennessee canceled a screening of Gone with the Wind due to its alleged insensitivity to a large segment of its local population. The argument goes that the film functions as the absolute apotheosis of Confederate lost cause mythology. The idea that the Confederacy was a doomed but noble endeavor, just and heroic, enacted not to protect slavery, but rather states' rights, and only in the face of overwhelming northern aggression. Which begs the question, should we still be watching Gone with the Wind? Seeing as how Confederate iconography and Confederate apologetics have been unquestionably linked to the rise of white supremacist hate groups in recent years, I think the issue is well worth discussing. Scarlett and her family are unapologetic slaveholders, and Scarlett especially. After she's forced to free her slaves at the end of the war, she simply switches from slave labor to prison labor, and makes absolutely no bones about either practice.
All I ask is that you keep the mill running and deliver my lumber when I want it.
Johnny Gallagher's your man, miss. But remember, no questions and no interference.
That's a bargain.
Her slaves, for the most part, are shown to be content and affable, Mammy's frequent tizzies notwithstanding.
Come on in here! Come on!
They're all freed as soon as the war is over, but they're not resentful of their former masters. If anything, they're happy to stick around, content and even flattered to remain in their employ.
Great Jehoshaphat. Great Jehoshaphat.
The film makes almost no attempt to question the morality of slavery, featuring but one line dedicated to the subject.
Scarlett, I will not make money out of the enforced labor and misery of others.
You weren't so particular about owning slaves.
That was different. We didn't treat them that way. Besides, I'd have freed them all when Father died, if the war hadn't already freed them.
Did you catch that? Because the moment passes pretty quick. He said he treated them well, and he would have set them free if the war hadn't done it already. More on that later. For the most part, the Confederacy is shown to be made up of proud, honorable men, braver than their northern counterparts, pulled into a war they didn't ask for because of their commitment to principle and family. In the interest of making a video that both Yankees and Confederates might actually watch, I thought we'd start at the very beginning of this debate and try to determine whether or not there's anything to this lost cause mythology in the first place. And in order to do that, we need to take a deep dive into Confederate apologetics. Oh, here it comes, I hear half my audience say. Another low T beta Yankee SJW coming to tell us that our heritage and history is problematic. Well, first of all, of course I have low testosterone. I'm 30 years old, and my hairline hasn't receded an inch. But perhaps more importantly, I am not a Yankee. Or at least, I wasn't raised as one. This is me, at the ripe old age of 6, posing in Confederate battle dress in the year of our Lord 1994 in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. My ancestors first immigrated from Europe in the early 1700s, and by the 1850s, bam! Most had set up shop in Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee, and the Carolinas, all of them slave states. I have over 400 relatives who fought for the Confederacy, and only about 5 who fought for the Union. My hometown is one of the reddest municipalities in all of South Florida. It's literally right next door to a town called, I shit you not, Plantation. I grew up neck deep in Confederate lost cause mythology. I attended Civil War reenactments as a kid where people shouted "Go Johnny Reb" from the sidelines like they were cheering on a football game. I was taught the bullet points of Confederate apologist ideology long before I ever even saw Gone with the Wind. So why do I tell you this? Well, I want the viewer, both Yankee and Confederate alike, to know that I intend to address only the most well-stated versions of Confederate lost cause ideology in this video. I'm not going to seek out the half-baked reasoning of completely ahistorical human truck nuts who can't tell the difference between the First Battle of Manassas and the Battle of Bull Run.
Now, first of all, let's look at how Alexander Stephens is portrayed here. Of course, faceless. His tie is red. Who wore a red tie back then?
I want to engage in good faith with the very best that Confederate apologists have to offer, because I sincerely believe that if you can't summarize your opponent's position in a way that makes them say, yes, that's what I believe, then you're not in any position to debate them. There's a second reason too, but more on that later. Number 1. The South had every right to secede, and secession didn't make them traitors. So from a legal standpoint, this is demonstrably false, a simple matter of fact. Proclamation 179, issued by President Andrew Johnson on Christmas Day, 1868, granted full pardon and amnesty for the offense of treason against the United States during the late Civil War. Well, so what? I hear my Confederate audience say. History is written by the winners. I'm sure if the Founding Fathers had lost the Revolutionary War, they would have been branded traitors by the British. So of course the United States would retroactively claim that what the Confederates did was treason. Doesn't change the fact that the legality of secession wasn't settled until after the Civil War. Well, it's certainly true that in the decades leading up to the Civil War, debates did indeed rage as to whether or not the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence allowed for unilateral secession. There's some language in there that suggests it's okay, and some that suggests it's not. There are even a few northern states who are at least discussing secession at various points throughout the early history of the United States. So the argument goes that since the Constitution didn't state conclusively one way or the other whether or not unilateral secession was legal, and since the Supreme Court didn't decide on the issue until Texas v. White in 1869, 1869, 4 years after the Civil War had ended, that the issue was decidedly undecided when the South ultimately seceded. But here's the thing, undecided isn't the same thing as legal. Let me ask you this. If the legality of secession was undecided when the South seceded in 1861, what ultimately decided the issue? Was it the Supreme Court ruling in 1869? Because it's not like the Supreme Court said, okay, going forward now, nobody has the right to secede. They said that no state had ever had that right. Was it the Union winning the war that decided the issue? Because if that's your reasoning, wouldn't that mean that states still have the right to secede so long as they beat the federal government in the ensuing war?
Oh God. That is what some of you believe, isn't it?
And even if we accept at face value the claim that secession was, or at least should have been legal, why didn't the South simply petition the courts for that right? Why did they opt instead to instigate a war that claimed 3% of the entire US population?
Number 2. The South didn't instigate the war. They only took up arms in response to an unprovoked invasion from the North.
Ah, yes, the age-old question. Which side ultimately started the Civil War? Well, this unprovoked invasion rhetoric usually refers to the Battle of Fort Sumter, the first battle of the Civil War.
In April 1861, South Carolina demanded the abandonment of Fort Sumter by Union troops, and when the federal forces stationed there refused to budge, South Carolina saw it as an illegal occupation of their land by a foreign military power and opened fire. Thus began the Civil War.
But here's the thing, South Carolina had already seceded months before the battle took place, and they didn't do it in response to any invasion.
They seceded, them and 6 other southern states, because they didn't like the stated policy goals of newly elected President Abraham Lincoln. South Carolina announced its intention to secede just 1 day after the vote.
And what's more, South Carolina didn't just secede, they seceded and then started seizing federal assets within their borders.
Like, imagine if the California State Senate didn't like the fact that Donald Trump had been elected president, so they declared the state an independent nation and then sent the state militia to seize the federal mint in San Francisco. Can you imagine what the country would look like if the federal government had let that sort of precedent stand?
Now, it's true that 4 Confederate states, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, only agreed to secede after the Battle of Fort Sumter took place. But lest we forget, that battle took place in South Carolina. Even if you accept at face value the claim that the Union presence at Fort Sumter was an invasion, it was only an invasion of South Carolina.
These 4 states could have chosen to side with the Union in the ensuing conflict, but they didn't. They promptly seceded and joined the Confederacy.
See, when Confederate apologists make the claim that it was the North who started the war, they're choosing to make a rather pedantic distinction between seceding and going to war. As far as the apologists are concerned, the South would have been thrilled to secede in peace, but those pesky Northerners couldn't leave well enough alone. And so when the North sent troops to try and quash the Confederacy, the South had no choice but to fight back in self-defense.
But that's like saying Germany didn't start World War II by invading Poland. It's the Allies who started World War II by deciding to attack Germany for invading Poland. The Allies should have just let Germany invade in peace.
It's an obtuse, ahistorical perspective that doesn't stand up to scrutiny. Secession was just as good as a formal declaration of war, and the South knew it.
CSA President Jefferson Davis issued the first call for Confederate volunteers on February 28, 1861, nearly 2 months before the Battle of Fort Sumter. Number 3. The Civil War wasn't fought over slavery.
The Civil War was explicitly, unequivocally, and inescapably fought over slavery. That's the state's right in question, the right to own slaves.
It wasn't the right to choose their own state mottos.
But don't take my word for it. Just ask Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens.
When our rights were threatened, the cry rose near and far. Hurrah for the bonny blue flag that bears a single star. Hurrah, hurrah, for Southern rights, hurrah.
So with such an unambiguous historical record, how could any Confederate apologist claim with a straight face that the Civil War wasn't fought over slavery? Well, this is where my upbringing comes in handy, because I happen to know the answer. Believe it or not, there are actually 3 distinct rationalizations for this claim. The first is that the war wasn't fought over slavery, but rather a state's right to secede. But as we saw earlier, this is something of a sloppy rebranding, a moving of the goalposts. It assumes that the motivation for secession is immaterial, whereas I'd argue it's critical.
Lest we forget, other states had threatened secession before the Civil War, but none of them ever actually did it, until an abolitionist got elected.
The second rationalization is that when Confederate apologists claim that the Civil War wasn't fought over slavery, they're specifically referring to your average, everyday, boots-on-the-ground Confederate soldier, who no doubt saw the war as less a defense of slavery than a defense of their hometowns.
They weren't out there in the battlefield going, I'm gonna keep my slaves. You're not taking my slaves, they're making me rich. I'm a racist. I love slavery.
But let's not lose sight of the forest through the trees here. the Civil War was a defense of slavery, regardless of the personal motivations of the 80% of Confederate troops who happened to not own slaves. The overwhelming majority of Southerners supported slavery whether they owned slaves or not. So sure, if you asked the Confederates why they were going to war, no doubt they'd say something like, because the North invaded. But if you asked them why they were seceding, slavery would be at the top of the list.
Now, the CSA did conduct some drafts, and Southern Unionists loyal to the federal government were sometimes detained without trial, or even summarily executed. And I can't say I don't have any sympathy for 19 and 20-year-old draftees who were conscripted by force into a war that might have been antithetical to their personal beliefs.
But these aren't usually the kinds of people that the Confederate apologists are thinking when they invoke this kind of defense. They're referring to the Confederacy as a whole. The third rationalization ignores the motivations of the South completely, and simply asserts that the Union wasn't fighting to free the slaves, but rather to preserve the Union. And for what it's worth, this thinking is actually pretty spot on, but as we'll see, it's also kind of irrelevant.
It's definitely true that the Union's #1 priority was to prevent secession, not abolish slavery. This is actually one of the things that gives me pause when I watch a film like Glory, which has a scene that explicitly states that the Union was fighting to free the slaves.
And that's what these white boys been doing for going on 3 years now. Dying by the thousands. Dying for you, fool.
But this couldn't be further from the truth. When Abraham Lincoln first drafted the Emancipation Proclamation, General George McClellan begged him not to issue it, thinking he'd lose half his officers if they thought the war was about abolishing slavery. Many Northerners were fine with letting the South keep slaves. One of the only films I've ever seen that even mentions this is the perennial cinematic masterpiece Little Women.
Here we come, a-wassailing among the leaves so green.
I do my own sewing, and Mrs. Finster's on Charles Street carries silk pieces ready-made. Tomorrow I'll take you there.
Marches haven't bought silk in years. They have views on slavery.
These are two Northerners talking here. One is against slavery, and the other couldn't care less, which reflects views that were typical of the time.
But for those of you keeping score at home, none of this has anything to do with the Confederate apologist position, that the Civil War wasn't fought over slavery. The North might not have been critically interested in why the South was seceding, but it's not like why the South was seceding wasn't critically important.
Number 4. Slavery apologetics. God, to think that such phrases exist.
So this is the last batshit bastion of Confederate lost cause ideology. It usually begins with somebody saying that slavery was very common at the time, and that we shouldn't judge the people of the past with the morals of the present. But here's my problem with that. Slavery wasn't that common at the time.
It might have been common in the American South, where as much as 20% of Confederate enlisted men and 40% of officers owned slaves. But it wasn't common in Europe, or in the rest of North and South America. Britain abolished slavery in 1833. Sometimes you'll read that they did it in 1807, but that was merely a ban on the importation of new slaves. 1833 was the year that they did it for real, albeit with a clause that their colonies could phase it out over the next 20 years. Denmark banned slavery in 1846, France in 1848. The last European country to abolish slavery was Portugal in 1888, although it spent the previous 60 years slowly phasing it out. Crossing the pond over to the Americas, we have Haiti abolishing slavery way back in 1804, the same year she gained independence from France. Mexico abolished slavery in all but Texas in 1829, just 19 years after achieving independence from Spain, and then extended the ban to include Texas the following year. Slavery was then reintroduced into Texas after the Mexican-American War. Canada abolished slavery in 1833, the last country in the New World to ban involuntary servitude outside the prison system was Brazil in 1888, and none of the countries I've mentioned had to fight a civil war to do it.
So at this point, Confederate apologists will usually say something like, well, so-and-so treated his slaves really well. Robert E. Lee taught his slaves how to read and write, and General such-and-such says he would have freed his slaves if only it hadn't been illegal. A similar sentiment is reflected in Gone with the Wind.
Ashley Wilkes says he would have freed his slaves if only he'd been allowed to do so.
Besides, I'd have freed them all when Father died, if the war hadn't already freed them.
And it's true that after the Haitian Revolution, the South got really spooked at the thought of a possible slave uprising, so they enacted new draconian laws that made it nigh impossible to legally divest yourself of slaves.
But even if it wasn't legal to free your slaves in 1860, neither was seceding from the Union. I mean, all anyone's proving with that observation is that their ancestors were willing to break the law to keep their slaves, but unwilling to break the law in order to set them free. And perhaps you're thinking, that's a perfectly reasonable level of morality to expect of one's ancestors. But here's what I'd say to that. I don't have any expectations of my ancestors. I really don't. I'm not talking about what I expected them to do. I'm talking about what they did. And if your first instinct at the mention of slave ownership within your family history is to try and soften it with context, rather than to vehemently denounce it with every fiber of your being, then I don't know what to tell you except that you picked some really weird hills to die on. And that's the second reason why I was eager to point out my Confederate heritage earlier in the video. I figure I need to claim it before I can disclaim it. Announce it so that I can denounce it, renounce it, as vehemently as possible, with every fiber of my being.
And if a declaration like that seems distastefully performative,
get up.
Rest assured, I don't think the work ends here.
If I could offer but one contribution to Confederate lost cause discourse, it would be to point out to all the Confederate apologists out there that the great sin of the Confederacy wasn't just that they owned slaves. See, a lot of modern white Americans look at the Confederacy and think that the only lesson to be learned is don't own slaves. But it's not. Not anymore, anyway.
The Emancipation Proclamation saw to that in 1863. You couldn't own slaves today even if you tried. Assuming you don't own a private prison anyway.
Slavery was the expression of their great sin, no doubt about it. But slavery itself was actually the effect of a much sneakier cause. The root cause of the Confederacy was that people supported a system of government that prioritized their comfort and status over everyone else. And at first this sounds like good common sense. Why wouldn't you support a politician who says he's got nothing but your best interests at heart? But look at what this sort of unexamined privilege did to the Confederates. It made them complicit in one of the greatest atrocities in all of American history. And can you guess why this is such a critically important lesson to be learned today? It's because people in America are still committing the exact same mistake.
The result isn't quite chattel slavery, but it is things like school-to-prison pipelines, systemic intergenerational poverty, chronic political underrepresentation, food deserts, redlining, restrictive covenants, black infant and maternal mortality rates that are 2 and 3 times higher than that of white people, the normalization of extrajudicial murder by law enforcement officials, a prison industrial complex that disproportionately disenfranchises black people, mandatory minimum sentencing, the separation of families and literal caging of brown people at the border, the denial of the right to apply for asylum, and the deliberate mischaracterization of modern civil rights movements as hate speech, to name only a few.
And if you think that none of those things can trace their lineage directly back to the Confederacy and all the racist politics that spawned it, then you probably need more than just a lesson in history. You need a re-education on the concept of causality itself.
There's a common refrain in Confederate country. It's about heritage, not hate. Which is to say, I'm not flying the Confederate flag because I hate anyone. I'm just trying to honor my heritage.
Well, if heritage is so important to you, I find it more than a little weird that you'd be so quick to cast aside the objections and concerns of the people who can't trace their heritage back by more than a few generations precisely because of the oppression and abuse that our ancestors inflicted upon theirs.
Like, you know how white people are always saying things like Irish pride or Polish pride, but you almost never hear African Americans saying things like Sierra Leonean pride, Burkinabe pride, or Senegalese pride? Ever wonder why?
It's because our great-great-grandpappies didn't keep records of their slaves' countries of origin. We literally have more data on their cattle. All they cared about was the price that they paid for them. Our heritage obliterated their heritage.
As much as was possible, anyway.
How can you not be sensitive to that? How can you not be desperate to atone? And maybe you figure there's nothing for you to atone for, since, after all, it's not like you kept any slaves, and you certainly didn't have any control over what your ancestors did, so why should you apologize? And I used to wonder the same thing. How is it my responsibility, or even my place, to apologize for the actions of my ancestors? You ready for the answer? Because they did it in my name. They did it for the prosperity of their descendants. But I don't want any benefits conferred through slavery. I know it's impossible for me to shed every single advantage that my ancestry affords me, but the least I could do is examine it. Be critical of it. As a person of considerable privilege, I consider it my responsibility to be as proactive as possible when it comes to the whole not being complicit in historical atrocities thing, because my privilege will try to make me complicit by default. But I don't want to be. I want to be as far ahead of the curve as possible on this. My ancestors were fully capable of doing the same, but they willfully and woefully chose not to. Maybe you don't care, but you can't say you don't know. And if you're too afraid to face that kind of self-scrutiny, even for the benefit of people who you may not consider to be within your in-group, then may I submit, you're not a rebel. You're a coward. Anywho, I think that about wraps up our thoughts on the Confederacy. Now we can finally turn our attention to the film. So, to begin, wait, how long is this video? Already? Oh, jeez.
Continued in the following edition.